Everyone, welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, June 4, 2024. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times news organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome to our audience throughout the United States and throughout the world. Our guest speaker today is the Honorable Newt Gingrich, who served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1978 to 1999 and was Speaker of the House from 1995 to 99. He is well known as the architect of the contract with America that led the Republican Party to victory in 1994, creating the first conservative majority in the House in 40 years. He was a Republican candidate for President of the United States in 2012. He's a well-known Fox News contributor, podcast host of Newt's World, and syndicated columnist. He is the author of 41 books, including 18 fiction and nonfiction New York Times bestsellers, including the current bestseller, March to the Majority. Speaker Gingrich and his wife, Ambassador Callista L. Gingrich, host and produce historical and public policy documentaries. Recent films include The First American and Divine Mercy. The canonization of John Paul II and Gingrich 360 is a multimedia production and consulting company based in Arlington, Virginia. He's been recognized internationally. We're very happy. He's a columnist also for the Washington Times. He's an expert and scholar on world history, military issues, international affairs. Speaker Gingrich teaches the Joint War Fighting Course for Major Generals. He also teaches officers from 6 services as distinguished visiting scholar and professor at the National Defense University. Our commentator today is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov. Dr. Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is also an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Our moderator today is the Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, a commentator on security issues. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani was the special envoy to the 6-party talks with North Korea, the director of National Counterproliferation Center, and associate director of national intelligence. Ambassador, we're going to have a great program today. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. It's appreciated. We're very fortunate to have Speaker Gingrich with us today. Let me just set the scene, if I may. May has been a very eventful month. We saw the visit of Xi Jinping to Europe, his visit to France, Hungary, Serbia. We saw the inauguration of Lai Ching, the new president of Taiwan. In his inaugural speech, he made it very clear that Taiwan presently is indeed an independent sovereign country. 3 days after that presentation, that's the inauguration speech, China conducted a military exercise around Taiwan and its 2 of its islands, using 49 aircraft and 19 naval vessels, to include the Coast Guard. Very significant military exercises. We just recently saw the trilateral summit in Seoul, South Korea, between President Yoon Suk-yeol and Premier Lee Chiang and Prime Minister Kishida. A very meaningful, if you will, summit. The one conducted just, well, it was 5 years ago in 2019 that the last trilateral summit was convened. And most recently, just as 2 days ago, the visit and the meeting, a very meaningful meeting of our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, with his counterpart in China, the Minister of Defense, Dong Jun. So a lot to unpack. We're so fortunate to have Speaker Gingrich with us. Over to you, Speaker Gingrich.
Well, I think people need to realize that the world is in many ways in the most precarious state that it's been in since the 1930s. You have a Russian attack on Ukraine, which is still going on and which has been escalating. The Ukrainians now have the support of both its European allies and the Americans to fire weapons into Russia. And they have begun to hurt Russian targets inside Russia in a way which may well lead to Putin trying to find some way to counter-escalate. So that's a dangerous situation. You have the ongoing war in Gaza, in which the Israelis so far have been very determined to root out every element of Hamas, the terrorist organization, which killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7th. And any pressure from the United States or the Europeans just seems to be ignored by the Israelis because they have, as a country, concluded that they cannot allow another attack by Hamas. And so they're really determined, I think, to finish the job, which has left them isolated, but in a way that anybody who studies Israeli history will understand. They've been isolated 3 or 4 times and continue to survive. And then people afterwards realize that they are an important country and a remarkable technological society, and they somehow get reintegrated into the world. I think the Chinese communists have sort of a multi-front effort underway. They have a diplomatic effort in Europe. They have an economic effort in Africa. They have a military effort with Russia, where in many ways they're Russia's ally. They help Russia subvert the sanctions of the West. They buy Russian and Iranian oil. So you have all of that underway. And the Chinese, the communist Chinese, are on offense not only around Taiwan, but with equal danger, I think. They're on offense in the South China Sea, where they're crowding, in particular, the Philippines. And as a result, they've really revived the Philippine-United States relationship. And recently, we've had Japanese, Australian, and American ships all operating as a joint flotilla in the South China Sea, sending a signal to China that they are actually creating a coalition of allies by their aggressive behavior. One of the hidden things people don't pay attention to, or it's not hidden, but people just don't notice it, is the rise of India. With the China one-child policy, they created a long-term demographic disaster because you create an inverted pyramid in which you end up with a lot more grandparents than children and grandchildren. They're probably going to be dramatically short of workers within a decade. They are going to shrink in population, and given the United States' porous borders and the number of illegal immigrants who come in as well as legal immigrants, the United States and China may be about the same population by 2070 or 2080. This is one of the things that Xi Jinping has to wrestle with, that he may have a window closing. You see some of this in the Chinese economy. You see it in entire ghost towns that they built that they thought they were going to fill up, and nobody's there. So there's been a huge socialist centralized government misallocation of resources, and China in that sense has interesting complexities. The other place I would point to is Iran, where recently, as you know, the Iranian president and the foreign minister were killed when a helicopter went down during a storm in the mountains in northeastern Iran. Interestingly, and the president there is the number 2 person. The supreme leader is the Ayatollah Khamenei, because it is a theological dictatorship or a theocratic dictatorship. But one of the interesting side facts about that wreck, that helicopter was an American helicopter bought while the Shah was in power. It has not been replaceable because of American sanctions. And it was literally a 45-year-old helicopter. And helicopters are hard to maintain. And the Iranians have this problem across their whole military system, that they have a substantial amount of equipment which is in danger of breaking. Now, they have some things they do well, drones, ballistic missiles. They do have a nuclear program. But you're seeing a country that is teetering. Someone pointed out to me in a podcast that we did at Newt's World that in the last election, only 7% of the people in Tehran voted. Now, if you have 93% of the people voting against the regime by not even voting, you have a tinderbox, a potential danger of an explosion that could happen at any time. Finally, I just want to mention we're talking at the beginning of the week-long elections in Europe for the European Parliament. It's going to be fascinating because there's an emerging, almost Trump-like movement in Italy and in Slovakia, in Hungary, and Holland, and across all of, and of course France, where Le Pen's party has been number 2 now for a generation. So there's an emerging effort to dramatically increase the number of seats they have in the parliament and see if they can create a European-wide coalition in the European Parliament. And finally, Britain has collapsed. The British Conservative Party has, for all practical purposes, disintegrated. They are probably going to lose very, very badly in an election in a few weeks. And that's one of the, I think, understudied stories is how, now they've been in power for 14 years, but in that process, they gave away all of their principles, all their ideology, and they're about to give away most of their seats. And that will be a historic watershed to have them so small that they really open up a space for other parties to begin to emerge in a way that we've not seen for a long time in British politics. So that's kind of a sweeping overview without even getting into the American side.
Wow, that was quite a presentation, Speaker Gingrich. Thank you so much. So much to unpack. You talked about Gaza, you talked about Ukraine, you talked about what's happening in Europe with the European Parliament elections coming up, the dynamics in China with the demographics. You talked about Iran. There's so much to unpack. Thank you for that excellent presentation. Over to you, Dr. Mansourov.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, and hello, everybody. Mr. Speaker, welcome to the program. What an amazing portrayal of the most important challenges facing us today all around the world. 360-degree perspective. Nothing less could have been expected from a man of your stature. Really a thought leader of modern civilization. So it's an honor for me. It's an honor for me to be on the same panel with you. And I noticed that you started with a hard question, the hardest question, and that is the fact that the world really is witnessing an escalation spiral in Europe. Something which started as a limited, conventional kind of excursion across the border 2.5 years ago, all of a sudden is threatening to turn into a major confrontation between the great powers. A couple of years ago, the position of this country was no lethal aid, only non-lethal weapons to a country which we thought kind of defended our values, represented our interests in Europe, in the center of Europe. And then we went through the anti-tank weapons, artillery pieces, long-range missiles. Now F-16s are about to start flying, F-16s capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Possibly, once that happens, within a couple of months, we may end up actually talking about the sharing of tactical nuclear weapons with the Ukrainian side. So that's a scary dynamics. And so my question to you is, it's a difficult one. Are you confident? Are you confident that all belligerents, and I'm saying all because, yes, it's easy to say this is just the Ukrainian and Russian situation, and, the rest of the world is kind of watching what's happening there. But as you know, sir, that's not the case. Without the US-led Western assistance, from supplying arms to intelligence, operational planning, even some eyes, ears, and boots, even boots on the ground. Ukraine would not have stood a chance, despite the bravery, displayed there. So, are you confident that all belligerents are rational actors there, that the situation is not going to get out of hand, that we still have a grip on that situation, that everything is under control? And as some people say, oh, he is bluffing, Putin is bluffing. There's no way Russia is going to use tactical nuclear weapons either in Western Ukraine, let alone across the border into the NATO domain. And so we can escalate as much as we want, really calling the bluff all the time, balancing on that fine line, pushing the envelope, kind of frying the frog slowly until we get what we want. Is everything really under control? Or should I start digging a bunker here? Should I start getting ready for the Third World War, given what's going on? I mean, let's not forget almost a million people were killed on both sides. This is unbelievable. 500,000 Ukrainians, I don't know how many Russians, but they say almost 1 million on both sides. The human toll of this war in 2 years is larger than what the United States suffered in the Second World War, in the U.S. Civil War, in Vietnam. Infrastructure destruction, I mean, is just mind-boggling. I mean, really, this is a human tragedy that's unfolding there. And do you think that we will be able to sit on our side of the big pond and kind of observe that tragedy endlessly, or do you think that at one point we'll come to the brink and then the Russians will start really pushing back? After all, this is a nuclear power, and there was no precedent in history with nuclear power being defeated, unless, of course, 1991, it's a different situation. They kind of decided to dismantle their own country by themselves, not on the battlefield. So again, are you confident that we're all rational here, that the situation is under control and escalation can be managed without the world slipping into the nuclear Armageddon?
I'm old enough that I remember the arguments and the debates and the thinking about nuclear war in the 50s and 60s, because that's when we first came to wrestle with it. That's what made Henry Kissinger's career, made Herman Kahn's career, a series of books on thinking about the unthinkable. And then I think we got into kind of a bureaucratic norm. They would build missiles, we'd build missiles, we'd sit down and talk. We had this ability to sort of veto each other and then to have competition within a non-nuclear framework. The problem, I'm a historian, not a political scientist, and the problem is that rationality is a function of the culture and personality that you're interviewing. What may be rational behavior to the Aztecs seemed irrational to the conquistadors, and vice versa. So you're in a situation where I believe that Putin had the same intelligence as the American military. Remember that General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, says at one point, said publicly, the Russians would be in Kyiv in 3 days. I think he believed that. I think his intelligence people thought that the Ukrainians would collapse and that the Russians would be a juggernaut. My hunch is that Putin's generals told him exactly. And then Putin found himself in a situation where he had been humiliated by the collapse of the initial offensive. And he made the decision that his capacity to stay in power, because it's a dictatorship, but not in the Stalin sense. I mean, he doesn't have the kind of iron control that you would have in a true system of totalitarianism. And I think he concluded that he was better off to expand the war than to accept a bloody nose. Now, at that point, the Europeans and the Americans really changed dramatically because they interpreted Putin's continued aggressiveness to mean that if he got conquered Ukraine, that he would put at risk Moldova, Eastern Poland, and the three Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And that would, of course, put at risk NATO. And so a collective consensus agreed that you could not reward this kind of aggression. And you all of a sudden, by the Poles, who were the most militantly anti-Russian and probably the most, other than the Baltic states, the most frightened. One of the side effects of what Putin achieved was Finland and Sweden, who had been rigorously neutral for the entire Cold War, joined NATO. Now, I think that was strategically an enormous defeat for Russia. I almost said Soviet Union. And so Putin went almost in a Hitlerian way toward a punishment campaign. Take out the infrastructure, take out the art museum, take out the hospital, use your missiles, because he found that his normal combat units weren't very good. They weren't winning at a normal combat level. And he decided on a war of attrition. And what's happened at each stage is the West has stepped in more and more with more equipment, more support, more money. There are some rumors that the French may actually be sending troops, regular troops, and that you may presently have sort of a coalition of the willing. Now, if you think of this as the authoritarians versus the democracies, on the other side, there have been at least, I think the estimate is, at least 1 million rounds of artillery shells have come from North Korea. The Iranians have been supplying several thousand drones, and the Chinese have been helping prop up the Russian army. So you have a joint alliance struggle underway, in which I would guess at some point in the near future, and I am told by people who supposedly know Putin, if you believe that's true, that anybody knows Putin, that he would actually like to find a way to get to a truce. That he realizes that he's, with each passing month, he's facing a bigger and bigger coalition, which is getting more and more aggressive, and that he probably can't conquer all of Ukraine. It's just too big a country. If that's true, then the question will be, what are the terms of the truce, and how does it work out? And I think if Putin thought he was going to be decisively defeated, he might be tempted to use tactical nuclear weapons. I think if he only thinks he's going to be hurt marginally, that he will just sacrifice more people. I mean, the Russians have an extraordinary capacity, going back to medieval history, to take casualties on a scale that, other than the Chinese, no one else has ever shown the ability to do that. So, and of course, he's been recruiting. I was told that the Ukrainians captured somebody from Nepal who had thought he'd been hired by the Russians to do a job in Russia and found himself in the Russian army. So, I mean, Putin is working very hard not to have people from St. Petersburg or Moscow on the front lines, and he's been trying to scrape up everybody else he can send. And Russia is still basically an imperial country. So if they can reach out to the Asian hinterlands and get people to fight for them, they will. That could go on for another 3 or 4 years. But you sense with the West a growing willingness to push back and to confront him. And I think that raises the chance. I personally think with as many, and we tend to forget this, Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. We have a lot of nuclear weapons. China is now third, but they're building more. They're a long way from parity, but they're certainly big enough that they could cause unimaginable damage. But Britain and France have nuclear weapons. Israel has nuclear weapons. Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons. So there are the danger and the likelihood of a nuclear war somewhere, I think, goes up a little bit every year, and it's something you have to take into account. We may need to study how to survive a nuclear war, not just how to avoid one.
So,
Thank you.
very good question, and thank you, Speaker Gingrich, for that excellent response. Let me pivot then, when we're talking about nuclear weapons, let me pivot to the recent summit, the trilateral summit between the China and South Korea and Japan, and the declaration, the joint declaration that came out of it. And I believe it was section 35 that spoke about peace and stability in the Northeast Asia region and on the Korean Peninsula, and the need for the Korean Peninsula to denuclearize comprehensively, verifiably. And South Korea, and North Korea responded immediately to the comment in that declaration that there should be complete verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and criticized China in that context, saying North Korea is never going to denuclearize. North Korea is committed to being a nuclear weapon state. So with that sort of preamble, let me ask you this question, Speaker Gingrich. North Korea obviously has nuclear weapons. They had the 6th nuclear test, which looked like it was a thermonuclear weapon in 2017. And certainly they have the ballistic missiles that could deliver them, to include ICBMs that could reach the whole of the United States. And the assessment is they could miniaturize those nuclear warheads and mate them to those intercontinental and short-range, medium-range ballistic missiles. So there are some in the United States, and I would think in Japan and possibly even in South Korea, that would say, let's just accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. In fact, they are a de facto nuclear weapon state, right? And they're looking for approval to be de jure, to be accepted as a nuclear weapon state. And the U.S. position heretofore has been, and I certainly support this position because of the nuclear proliferation issue per se, that we should not accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. But there are those who say, accept them as a nuclear weapon state. They're not going to denuclearize. And let's get into an arms control scenario here where they could stop producing these nuclear weapons, and we can start looking at reducing the nuclear stockpile. On that question itself, Speaker Gingrich, how do you feel? Do you believe we should accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and pursue, if you will, an arms control scenario with North Korea?
Well, that's a very good and a very troubling question. My dad served in Korea in 1953 and went back. He was regular Army, and he went back in the late 60s. I had a very long interest in both protecting South Korea and in the evolution of North Korea, which has mostly been to become more isolated, more sophisticated. I mean, I think people have to recognize that as the hermit kingdom, which in many ways Kim Jong-un could trace his tradition into medieval history, that the North Koreans see themselves as a almost semi-religious state in which they are the bearers of a unique civilization, which from their standpoint has been undermined by the South as it became more prosperous and more moderate and more democratic, and therefore lost some of its Koreanness, if you will, as defined by the North. I think there are times when you make more progress by not making progress. So if I were asked, and I'm not an expert, although I've spent a lot of time, including with the American intelligence community, on trying to understand Kim Jong-un and his father and his grandfather. I think you have to start with the idea that they have an enormous investment. I mean, the percent of their economy, the number of really smart people that they have invested for 2 generations now in developing this military capability means that even if Kim Jong-un personally got up one morning and said, gee, I'd like to find a way out of this, the odds are pretty good he'd get killed. I mean, there's so many people who are so deeply invested in sustaining their system. I think you also have the challenge that they look around the world, as somebody pointed out, both Libya and Ukraine are good arguments that having nuclear weapons may be necessary just to minimize people attacking you. After Gaddafi gave up his chemical weapons program, he was vulnerable and disappeared. And that the Ukrainians who had given up the weapons they had at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact, would not have been vulnerable if they still had the kind of nuclear capability they had in 1991. So I think my advice would be, don't try to deal with it. That is, you're not going to get them to say they're not a nuclear power. You don't particularly want to say they are a nuclear power per se. But you want to find some way to open communications. And frankly, as long as they're passive, South Korea is going to get richer, Seoul's going to get bigger, the gap's going to get wider. And the question is, like East Germany, collapsing because life in the West was so unbelievably better. Is there a next generation or a generation after that where people just say, you know, this just isn't worth it? I mean, look what we could be doing if we weren't trapped in this nightmare. But at the moment, I think the nightmare is real. I think it is pretty capable of defending itself. I mean, I have two other thoughts that may be heretical. One, from a purely American standpoint, it doesn't much matter whether we have nuclear weapons on the peninsula. We are at most from an ICBM reaching Pyongyang. We are probably 16 to 18 minutes from a Trident-launched weapon reaching Pyongyang. So, I mean, we will have a capacity to annihilate the regime under any circumstance. And I think they probably know that, and we might want to occasionally remind them that we don't exercise that capacity. And probably if we really wanted to do it with a sort of a bolt out of the blue, to use an old term, we could probably actually eliminate them before they could use any of their weapons, because I don't think they could respond that fast. That's a guess on my part. I'm not an expert. Second, our overwhelming interest is in maintaining as a free and prosperous state in safety. And I think doing whatever it takes to ensure that North Korea understands that this is sacrosanct, that you know, I mean, one of the major purposes of American troops in South Korea is not to fight, because the truth is you have a pretty large and competent South Korean army. One of the purposes is that they're a tripwire. They're a vivid, you cannot do a military plan for South Korea without having to kill a lot of Americans. And that's very important. When I was a child, my dad was stationed in West Germany, and the primary purpose was not to be able to counterattack, et cetera. The primary purpose was to say, there are so many American families here that if you started a war, you would kill so many Americans that you would inevitably be involved in the full might of the United States. And so I think making sure that North Korea understands that they can survive a long time as long as they do nothing. But if they did anything of substance, they would literally disappear as a regime, I think is, and then trying to find other topics where you can talk with them. But you know far better than I do, you're the expert here, I'm just an observer. But my impression is they're very hard to talk to. I mean, they just basically say, you know, we're not interested.
That's a very good point. Do you think China could help us to get to sit down with North Korea and talk about being a little more moderate and stop this escalation?
I actually don't. I mean, it's always an American hope, and it would be nice if it worked. But I'm always reminded, if you go to Seoul, which you've done, and you go to the Great War Museum, which is fascinating, and you look at the medieval warfare section, you know, the Koreans spent a large part of their history fighting China and Japan. Mm-hmm. And the Koreans, I think, and again, you two are experts and I'm not, but my sense is that we get confused because we think since they're both Asian, that somehow they have some method of communicating. Well, I think the Koreans are deeply suspicious of the Chinese. I'm talking now about the North Koreans. South Koreans are suspicious for different reasons, but they do an awful lot of business. So they're pretty good at dancing with the Chinese communists on a mutually profitable basis. But I think the North Koreans understand that if China could coerce them, it would. And they would then begin to lose their Koreanness.
Right.
And I think that I might be wrong, but I really do see this as a recreation of a medieval kingdom with all of the desire for isolation. I mean, the reason it was called a hermit kingdom, I mean, their number one goal with Japan and China was to keep them out, not to learn to trade with them, not to swap ideas with them or hang out together. Keep them out. Let us speak Korean and go away. And so I think there's a limited amount that the Chinese can achieve in trying to pressure the North. And the times we've tried it, the North has basically said, it's more important for us to be independent than it is for us to have whatever you can give us. But again, you know this history far better than I do, so correct me if I've got this wrong.
No, thank you, Speaker Gingrich. That's outstanding. Over to you, Dr. Mansourov.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Speaker, you mentioned 28,500 American troops deployed on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, you said this is a very rich country, South Korea, and it's growing only richer day by day to the chagrin of the neighbors to the north. So I have a simple question. A few weeks ago, one of the leading presidential candidates in this country said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that it's time for the Republic of Korea to pay up, or if he's elected, the U.S. troops will be leaving the peninsula. Again, I'm paraphrasing here, so it was a much more nuanced kind of statement. So that caused a lot of concern, obviously, in Seoul, as you can imagine. And so I'd like to know your take on this. You have some insights on the thinking in this presidential candidate's head. So was it a bargaining ploy, during the defense cost sharing talks? So he was trying to help the U.S. delegation to kind of increase its leverage, or was he serious at all? Or, as some people said, it might have been a knee-jerk reaction to the kind of overspending Ukraine aid package. And so others said, no, maybe it's some personal grudge that he might have towards some people who mistreated him in Seoul. Or is he just setting the stage for a potential kind of arms control negotiation, strategic negotiation with North Koreans and South Koreans in the future? I mean, what's going on here? What is your take on that pay up or will leave from Korea approach?
I think Trump has been pretty clear about that around the world. I mean, he said very bluntly to NATO, you need to be at least at 2% of your gross domestic product in your defense budget, or I don't understand why I'm supposed to defend you, which people thought was a shocking idea. But he's trying to get something clear, which is the contract that we had coming out of World War II, because all of our competitors had been bombed, we were about 50% of the world's economy, literally. Half the world's economy was American. And so we adopted a policy of pouring out money in order to prop up our allies against what we saw as real threats. Trump represents, both in trade policy and in national security policy, a transition to an era when we're the biggest country in the world, but we have limits, and where most of our allies have grown dramatically wealthier. So, asking the Germans to at least pay the minimum at a time when the German economy is now sick for a variety of reasons, but it has been historically for the last 2 or 3 decades, far and away the strongest economy in Europe. There's no reason the Germans can't do at least 2%. We're at, I think, above 3. We're going to, under Trump or Biden, we're going to increase our defense budget. And it's largely driven by the Chinese, but it's also driven by the global war on terrorism and the rise of radical Islam, and it's driven by the Iranians, and it's driven by Russia. So if you look at the threat indicators around which you start to build a defense budget, and you realize, while the Chinese are diplomatically a global country, and just in terms of trade, they're a global country, they don't attempt to be militarily a global country. They'd like to be a hegemonic country for Eastern Asia, but they can't even achieve that as long as the alliance, if you have a South Korean, Japanese, Taiwan, Philippines, Australian American alliance, it's impossible, even in their own backyard, for the Chinese to become a hegemon. And if you throw in India as it grows, and India will now dwarf China, then it really becomes impossible. But that happens because, we have to rebuild our Navy. We have to develop a new capacity for long range. The American military had been sized for the Middle East and for Europe. Well, those are relatively short range. You start in the Pacific, you have to have a whole different weapon set and a whole different range of capabilities because the distances are so enormous. So I think Trump's looking intuitively that he's going to have to reinvest a lot, just objectively. And therefore, his wealthy allies should also invest a lot. And he's willing to share the burden, but he's not willing to carry the burden by himself. But I don't think he has any interest in leaving South Korea undefended. And I think he understands that South Korea is a key linchpin, as is Japan, to preserving American interest in the region. And that, to in any way send a signal to Kim Jong-un that an attack on South Korea would be acceptable would be suicidal. And Trump fully understands. I mean, he's met with Kim Jong-un. He's the one Western leader who can say he's talked to him and has a sense of who he is and how he operates. I think in a funny way, Trump has some serious respect for him because he's so tough. And, the guy who likes, things like universal fighting sort of understands that, Kim Jong-un would be a pretty good cage fighter. So he wants to have stronger South Korean support and stronger Japanese support for containing and deterring North Korea.
Those are very excellent points, Speaker Gingrich. Some have said, to follow up on the excellent question and your response, is that maybe we should just, because China is becoming such a, if you will, a threat to the region and beyond, we should just focus more on China, and maybe even consider removing some of those 28,500 troops from South Korea and so forth. If I heard you correctly, you agreed we do need those 28,500 troops in South Korea. You said a tripwire. You spoke of your father being in the Korean War and going back in the 60s. Our presence there is so important. Do you agree with that? And those who say, let's stop focusing on the Korean Peninsula and focus more on China, and to include possibly even moving some of those troops out of Korea, how do you respond to that?
Well, my first question would be, where are you going to move them to? If your interest is stability in East Asia, they're probably located as well as they could be. So where are you going to put them? You're not going to put them in Taiwan. Second, I don't actually care what the number is. I care that it be a number large enough that Kim Jong-un understands that an attack on South Korea is an attack on the United States.
Yes.
And I think that's the key. And I think that, frankly, there'll be a negotiation. Trump's 4 years, we're all negotiating. He likes to negotiate. He made his career negotiating. And he believes that he should ask for the largest, possible outcome. And then he expects you to come back from your side and tell him what you want to do. And then you try to negotiate and get to some agreement. But he doesn't. A friend of mine once said that in business, unlike politics, you should never be embarrassed to ask for too much or offer too little. That's the whole point of the negotiation. And I think that that's where Trump starts. He starts that way on the economy. where he makes the case that if you look at the scale of South Korean success, we're not talking about the country of Syngman Rhee, and we're not talking about a poverty-stricken nation. We're talking about one of the wealthiest and most aggressive entrepreneurial societies in the world. And so he'll be negotiating on the economic front. He'll be negotiating on the payment front in terms of the military. But I don't think that he would want to send any signal to Kim Jong-un that there is any weakness in the American commitment to South Korea remaining safe and prosperous.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. Thank you so much. Dr. Mansourov.
Thank you, Ambassador. Again, fantastic answers from the speaker. I'm learning so much every minute I'm listening. Now, let me ask you a big question today, really $1 trillion question. You are the big thinker. This country buried $1 trillion in the caves of Afghanistan. Then it buried another $1 trillion in the deserts of Mesopotamia in Iraq. So my question is it really in the U.S. national interest to continue that war in Europe and deliver strategic defeat to Russia, let alone decolonize, quote unquote, Russia, a nuclear power, which, as you suggested, I mean, has an enormous kind of degree of tolerance for pain and for casualties. So far, that war cost the United States and its allies $278 billion. Now, we are still away from $1 trillion mark, but really, how high is the price that this country would be willing to pay to basically eliminate that strategic competitor? Are we talking about $1 trillion mark here, or something more sensible before we kind of walk away from that? Because it's existential for the other side. I mean, you talked about truce maybe, but looking at what's happening on the ground, hard to believe. So $1 trillion question. We still have $750 billion to spend before we call it a quits and pull out, or is it something more sensible, which we should expect?
Well, I think, unfortunately, in warfare, your opponent often dictates part of what happens. It's not a single choice. I believe that stopping Putin, whether stopping Putin means that you get to a truce somewhere along the current battle lines, or whether stopping Putin means that you gradually cause so much pain inside Russia that he decides he has to reach a negotiated settlement. I don't think Ukraine can defeat Putin in a direct, normal sense. I mean, I don't think they're going to be able to drive the Russians totally out of Ukraine. On the other hand, I think they can cause enough pain that Putin decides that this was a bad experiment and that he accepts some kind of agreement, and part of which would probably involve Ukraine becoming part of NATO for the future as a trip line to say you can't do this again. I personally believe that I mean, look, I have no defense for how stupid the American policy in Afghanistan was. And I've written about it. I'm very saddened that we have not had a grand strategic review. To fight in a country for 22 years, lose 4,000 dead, 50,000 wounded, spend $1 trillion, and be defeated should be intolerable. And it's something that it's a habit we got into in Vietnam, and we really need a profound rethinking of the Pentagon and of the way in which we design and implement national security. The part of the question is what has been an ongoing American turmoil. That is, if you look at the Obama-Biden desire to somehow integrate Iran as though it was a normal country, and then you look at the desire of all of our Arab allies to isolate Iran because they don't think it's a normal country, that's been a mess that's been ongoing now for at least a decade. I think the question I would pose to you is very different. If Putin wins, if we get exhausted, if ultimately there is no aid, there is no weapons, the Ukrainians are defeated, and the Russian flag is on the Polish border, on the Romanian border. Is there any reason to believe that Putin would learn a lesson that would make him less aggressive? Or is it more likely that he would now start crowding Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania? And my guess is that his interest, which he said publicly, is essentially reestablishing the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire. And he said he's been very open about that. So allowing him to win the largest prize of rebuilding that empire, I suspect, within a decade would lead to a new war, and potentially a more dangerous.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. Let me pivot, if I may, to Taiwan. I mentioned in the opening, on the 23rd of May, China commenced 2 days of military exercises around Taiwan and 2 of its islands. And this is the 3rd significant military exercise that China has initiated to literally intimidate Taiwan and its leadership. And this follows the inauguration of a new president, Lai Ching-te. So, and also some of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing is pretty strident on this issue of independence and accusing the new leadership in Taiwan of being separatists, etc. So how do you see this developing, Speaker Gingrich? Based on this most recent military exercise, I think some of us would say China is, to include its Coast Guard and the naval forces that PLA Navy that came into it, I believe about 19 or 20 naval vessels, and then the Coast Guard getting very much involved, looking at maybe an embargo or or possibly even an invasion. What do you see the prospects for a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue with the People's Republic of China?
Well, again, I think there's a good prospect that we'll have 20 or 30 or 40 years of Beijing demonstrating while Taiwan becomes more important in terms of chip production. I mean, I think of the most sophisticated chips in the world, 70% are manufactured in Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about a potential threat to the world economy that is breathtaking. I also think this is probably an aberrant thought counter to the norm. I think anytime the Chinese communists want to make Taiwan untenable, they can create a maritime zone around Taiwan and so raise the insurance costs that they would have effectively blockaded the island in a way that would basically be coercive. I think they don't do it for a lot of different reasons. One, I'm not at all sure that the bureaucracy in Beijing wants to try to integrate Taiwan, because that would be over 20 million people who are quite comfortable being free. And the level of disruption that might involve far, far more than Hong Kong would be interesting. Furthermore, it would alienate virtually every commercial trading partner China has. And I think there are a lot of second-order effects. I personally think it's possible for the Chinese communists to coerce Taiwan by a variety of ways of establishing and possibility of trading. I think it's almost impossible for them to invade Taiwan. The Germans at their peak could not cross a 21-mile channel. They just found it It took us years, and of course, D-Day is celebrated because it was such an extraordinary achievement. And we threw 100,000 people on the shore of France in the first 24 hours. the Chinese communists would suffer casualties, I think, on such an extraordinary scale, trying to cross, I think it's 140-mile strait. And between American submarines, Australian submarines, Japanese submarines, I mean, there are a lot of people who'd come to play. No, this would not be a China-Taiwan game. This would be the alliance. Furthermore, China requires imports for the system to work, and they don't have an ability to protect, for example, Hong Kong and Shanghai. If we decided to blockade it, they couldn't sustain it. So maybe I'm being too much of an optimist. I think that as long as the Taiwanese engage in the dance, that they're independent, but they're not declaring independence, the communists will engage in the dance that they're not going to tolerate independence, but they're not going to invade this week. And we've come a long way now. It's been over 50 years since the Shanghai Declaration, and we're still dancing.
Yes, but you do see a blockade as a possibility.
Oh, I think they could blockade simply by creating a maritime zone in which no insurance company would insure she wouldn't have to physically blockade. They would simply have to announce that we can't secure the safety because we're going to be engaged in military activities. And we would hate for one of our ships or one of our missiles to strike your ship. And I think most of the world's insurers would promptly say, we're not going to insure any ship to go into that zone.
Right. Thank you so much, Speaker Gingrich. Look, we covered, we just talked about Taiwan, talked about the Korean Peninsula, North Korea, certainly the war in Ukraine. You mentioned Gaza up in your initial comments, Speaker Gingrich. You covered so many issues here. I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today on the Washington Brief. This has been very, very insightful for all of us. And I know for our listeners also. So, and I thank you, Michael, Dr. Jenkins, and the Washington Times and the Washington Times Foundation for permitting us to have these sessions. Very
vigorous and interesting conversation. I rely heavily on the Washington Times every day for what's happening both in the United States and around the world. And it's an institution that I think is very important to balancing the information flow in Washington. So it's an honor for me to be able to have this kind of sophisticated conversation with people who know as much as you two do.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. It was an honor for all of us. To you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Ambassador DeTrani. Great moderation, as always. And Dr. Mansourov, your brilliance and insight. And Mr. Speaker, again, you take us on such a journey of history and also current facts and knowledge, but it's always got hope underneath as the foundation. There's always hope. I always find your vision to be one of a future where we will achieve a better world as we continue to cooperate, work together. I want to thank the Washington Times and Chris Dolan, Guy Taylor, and others for covering these programs. And I know Korea is going to be very interested in this, as well as our viewers around the world. I want to thank you all, and let's have a great week.